So we'll make this bigger and we'll hope. Good. Here we are at the time to talk about 18th century colonial developments. We'll start by talking about a few colonies we haven't discussed yet. We'll move on to the Age of Reason and the intellectual context for 18th century cultural change. We'll look at the colonies. We'll talk about mercantilism to a great extent, the economic system that dominated the colonies and stamped them with their Englishness in the period of the mercantilist policy. We'll end with a talk about crops and wealth and estates and that. So we're going to develop a number of themes, but for the most part, what we want to do is say that in the 18th century, the colonies built on the 17th century roots of the colonies and flourished in the 18th century into the emerging world power called the United States of America. The colonies, in addition to Massachusetts and New England, the region around there, and Virginia, the Chesapeake economy, you had Pennsylvania emerging in the 18th century as the best poor man's country. This painting shows William Penn dealing relatively fairly with Native Americans because Penn and the Quakers established policies that were relatively enlightened. Again, the key word is relatively, but Indians actually moved to Pennsylvania because they heard that there was a white guy that was more interested in treating them as equals than as rivals. Other colonies involved South Carolina, which was a colony of a colony, became a rice growing colony for the slaves of Barbados. South Carolina was a majority slave population from the very beginning of settlement. New York was a combination of Dutch and English traditions in a relatively tolerant religious context. The Dutch didn't really care what religion you were as long as they could make money off of you. And they instilled that sort of priority in their colony that they established that eventually becomes known as New York. Now, the Age of Reason is the term we use to describe the period from 1540 till 1789. The scientific revolution was the first half of the Age of Reason, and the Enlightenment was the second half of that time period. And what the scientific revolution taught people was generally how the laws by which the universe worked. And so Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler and Brahe and Descartes, culminating in the writings of Isaac Newton in the late 1600s, laid out very clearly and very scientifically how the universe works. And this spirit of rationalism, this questioning of the way things were, this tolerance for other people believing other things, all of that spirit the spirit, especially of rationalism, informed the Enlightenment. If we can figure out how planets move, perhaps we can figure out the best way to organize society, or to build a prison, or to build a school. So all this informed the Enlightenment in the period from 1689 till 1787. John Locke was the most famous English figure of the Enlightenment, and he wrote about a theory of revolution, building on the ideas of Thomas Hobbes and his social contract theory. Locke more or less posited that people are nasty, mean, brutish, and short, and that they ought to form governments to protect their property, but that the people retain the right to overthrow that government when it becomes destructive of property rights. So he's famous for that idea, and Jefferson will, of course, use that idea in the Declaration of Independence. Locke also taught about tabula rasa, a blank slate, that we are born a blank slate, and whatever we learn shapes us into the people that we are. So Locke called for better institutions to teach us to be better human beings, and that social progress would occur as a result of that. Okay, Americans were becoming literate in the 17th century, certainly. There was American literacy that was emphasized all over the colonies, but especially in Puritan New England, where reading the Bible had its own payoff. So American kids generally were taught to be literate in numbers far greater than the countries that sent immigrants to America. The Great Awakening and the picture you see here of the religious revival of the 18th century had gained a lot of adherents, a lot of believers in the Great Awakening, this religious revival of about 1739, 1740, 41. New sects were emerging: Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, that had a more involving kind of religious service for the parishioners on Sunday morning. Whereas before, the Church of England had a college-educated minister who was generally delivering pretty boring intellectual sermons on Sunday. Now all of a sudden, the new sects of religions emphasized a more involved and emotional kind of experience. And this democratizes churches, where anyone who felt the calling could be a minister, not just those that had attended college, for instance. So this shows the religious breakdown of the colonies around the middle of the 18th century. You can see the brown Puritan area of congregational churches in New England, but most of the colonies was Church of England, was Anglican. There's pockets of Lutherans and Presbyterians and others, but for the most part, the English colonies belonged to the English church, and that's the way it worked. Now, mercantilism is the economy of the colonial period. It's defined as government involvement in the economy from 1650 to 1776. That power follows wealth, that you want to have exports greater than your imports. So you form colonies to help you become self-sufficient in all things. The idea is that you buy nothing from your neighbor if you can get it from your colony. So the Navigation Acts were passed in England, but all countries passed a form of the Navigation Acts from 1651 till 1787. They all believed that they were competing for a finite amount of wealth in the world that could always be expressed in gold and silver, and that this was the goal, to fight for a bigger slice of the pie. Now, that was the theory of mercantilism, and it was enforced to some extent, but to a great extent it was also ignored, and that is known as salutary neglect. They neglected to enforce the Navigation Acts, but it was salutary, beneficial, positive. It had a positive effect on the colonies themselves and on England itself. That the Navigation Acts were neglected in enforcement, but to the extent they were enforced, there was a salutary impact of the Navigation Acts on the colonies. All this was criticized by Adam Smith. He was a huge opponent of mercantilism and believed that countries would be better off, like individuals would be better off, if they pursued self-interest, if laissez-faire, let the people do what they want to do. Let the government keep hands off the economy. That we should have a free enterprise, a capitalistic system that allows us for more free competition between companies and countries than mercantilism would allow. Nevertheless, here's a map of the regions. Nevertheless, it can be said that Americans were impacted by the Navigation Acts, and that the salutary neglects of the British Parliament had relatively good results for the colonies. So in the left-hand column, you can see exports by region, and there are 4 regions: New England, Middle Colonies, Chesapeake, and Lower South. And you can see that they went different places. And then, and that they involved different products in the exports from the colonies. So let's look at these in more detail. This is showing all 4 regions lumped together, and it shows where the exports come from. And not surprisingly, most of the exports come from the Chesapeake and the Lower South. And most of those exports ended up in Great Britain and the West Indies. And that is defined as legal trade by the Navigation Acts. But everything that went to Southern Europe, and I'd say roughly half of what went to the West Indies, was smuggling. Americans learned to smuggle in reaction to the Navigation Acts. So that was the way they did it. Here's New England, which has on the left-hand side, you can see a relatively balanced economy, and most of it going to the West Indies, and just a little more than 18% going to Great Britain. So that was the New England pattern. The bread colonies of the middle colonies exported grain to a great extent, and they exported it to the West Indies and Southern Europe, with a very small percentage going to Great Britain. However, the Chesapeake, exporting tobacco mostly, sent most of that to Great Britain and some of it to the other regions. But you can see that this is where the Navigation Acts had the most impact. And on the south, the lower south, you can see rice, indigo, and other things going to Great Britain and the West Indies to a great extent, so that they follow the Navigation Acts, but to a lesser extent than they were designed. This series of charts shows that crop yields, division of estates, and average landholding in Concord all declined over the 100 years between 1670 and 1770. Farms got smaller in New England because they practiced partible inheritance, giving an equal share of farmland to each of the male heirs, to each of the sons. And you can see that resulted in smaller farms yielding smaller crop yields per acre as the land began to be farmed more intensively. And this led to many farmers leaving New England and going to Boston, where they had in 1771 only 0.1% of all the wealth of New England, whereas in 1687, the poorest 30% of Bostonians controlled 2.6% of the wealth. So the poor people of Boston were increasingly unable to compete in this world as it emerged in the 1770s. And they're going to be pretty rowdy when they get around to dumping tea in the harbor and other things. So that shows the values of the people who came to America in the 18th century. The English tried to control the colonies and to some extent succeeded, but to another extent, their efforts to control the colonies ended up in failure. Okay, that's the lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.